major rebuttals which are completely dismissive of the case set up today, before I move on to my case proper. Right? Firstly, he creates this false dichotomy between political rights, right of life, and social economics, and presumes that the debate is about the latter and not the former. But as Joey has already showed you, you cannot put the cart before the horse. You have to, it is a natural progression. If I don't even respect your life, if I don't respect your right to live as a human being, how then can you expect that very same state to be affirming your social economic rights, affirming your right to a job, affirming your right to your right to welfare? So it is a necessary condition for social justice. And we say that necessary condition is not even met in the kind of context we are talking about. We are not talking about Western liberal democracies here. We are talking about countries where the state itself, the state apparatus itself, institutionalize and perpetuate these social injustices and marginalized groups, right? And we're talking about countries where usually it's a minority in the population that was in power, such as the Quadra tribe who were in power during Gaddafi's Libya, or the Alawites in Syria who are minorities and disenfranchised a large majority of various other tribes. That is the context we talk about. And we tell you again that this debate is about dealing with one extreme form of social injustice. What do we do against this extreme form of injustice perpetuated by the state? Is the political violence a legitimate tool to deal with this? That's what this debate is about. And they've never been able to once tell you, what then without this tool? How then do you address these people's grievances? Because given that they've accepted in our context that these people are literally screwed over in these countries, right? Then how then are they going to be able to get the social injustices incorrected without their political tools? There's simply not going to be a kumbaya that occurs naturally, right? That's the problem, right? Let me deal with two other fallacies coming from that case. First, they assume, right? They just tell us it's wrong to work outside the mechanism. It's wrong to try to address your grievances outside the mechanism, without telling us A, what are the merits of working within the mechanism, why the mechanism is so sacrosanct, especially when the mechanism itself is part of the problem and is part of the victimization, part of the tool, part of the problem in the very first place that needs these people to work outside there. Secondly, this idea of moral interlocutor he talks about between state and the people. How can a state where authority is usurped rather than voted for, unlike in democracies, where does Mubarak or Gaddafi in Libya in the first place get their moral authority for? How can they be a genuine moral interlocutor between people? How can the Sri Lankan government be a genuine moral interlocutor with the Tamils? Right? But before I move on to my extensions proper, I'll take one from closing.
Are you saying that the Kurds, through the mechanism of the PRK, are legitimate in assaulting the head of the state of Turkey? Or are you saying that they can legitimize violence against any person who's employed by the state?
Again, we do not need to go into such minute details, right? The point of the policy is simply this, right? We are talking about injustices within the state, right? We talk about all forms of political violence. Let us not get into a debate where we are discussing about gradations of political violence. When we talk about political violence can only be effective if all the options are on the table. Otherwise, there's no point talking about political violence at all. No point being toothless, having a toothless mechanism, right? But let me then go on to three of my extensions proper. Firstly, why it's important to create urgency and visibility to the international community and even to the general populace by picking up political violence. You create that visibility. Firstly, you communicate to the international community that the local population's aspirations are changing. The local population wants to get rid of these dictators, right? And we see countries like America and the other Western countries then coming behind these populations and supporting them. But before these people rose up in revolt in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, these countries were supportive of Mubarak, were supportive of Gaddafi, right? They were on the same side and they presumed, and they were complicit in the oppression because they presumed the people were okay with it. They presumed the people were taking it. It was out of sight, out of mind on the international diplomatic agenda. And once these revolts happened, once the political violence has erupted, the international community had no choice. They had to stick with the high moral ground, first of all. Secondly, to the domestic population itself. Often you see in countries where there's a small segment of population being oppressed like Sri Lanka, you see indifference among a large section of the majority. The indifference, the inaction plays into the propaganda by the people who oppress that this isn't such a big problem, that these minority groups are being unreasonable, or it's not so bad, the situation isn't so urgent, their aspirations isn't something that has to be urgently dealt with. The Tamil rights can wait another 10-20 years, isn't such a big problem, just a small bunch of people. We say creating that urgency to the local population through violence is also the best way to get them to start to persuade and put pressure on the state apparatus. Put pressure on the state apparatus that something needs to be done. No thank you, sir, sit down. Right? But secondly, we talk about how passivity by these movements that are fighting for their rights, fighting for their enfranchisement, passivity will also connote that they acquiesce with these movements, or they are inactive movements. It hurts their own credibility, their own legitimacy, their own ability to sort of mobilize and get their rights enfranchised. Take Sri Lanka, for example. During the ceasefire, there was major infighting between the various Tamil Tiger leaders. Prabhakaran couldn't control some of the generals, and this stymied their agenda to try and fight for Tamil rights in the first place. Right? We also see ultimately when these groups cannot get together and there's an infighting and there's suspicion, it's a lot harder for them to push the agenda, and ultimately, even if political violence is taken up, it will not be effective. Right? Lastly, it alters the cost calculus in denying these people their aspirations towards the people in power. It alters this cost calculus in two ways, right? Firstly, it puts in a much more, it makes it much more costlier to ignore these people's aspirations, to ignore the fact that these people have genuine grievances that we better deal with, right? Even if they don't deal with political rights, ultimately they are forced to make concessions. They are forced to make certain concessions because of this fear of violence. Because they know these people are not simply going to take it, they are going to make it a decision costly for you, right? And when such a calculus is made, ultimately it also creates an additional check and balance against ensuring that it's not merely a minority tribe or a minority interest that governs the country, that there's some incentive to allow some political avenue for banking, or at least even for communicating about policies by the other groups of people. And we see this happening in Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi, right? We see at least a coalition of interests developing and talking to each other, versus a time during Gaddafi where there was simply just a Quadra tribe ruling over everybody else, and there was simply no question, and there was simply no question about it, right? For all these reasons, we say this is the debate. We hope everybody else continues with the debate. For all these reasons.